Have you ever been in a moment where you realize the people you trusted most might not care about the thing that matters most to you? I wish I could say that moment never came for me, but it did. And it happened in a hospital ICU, while my 7-year-old son was fighting for his life. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let me ask you something. If your grandchild needed a life-saving surgery, and you could easily afford it, would you help? Most people wouldn't even hesitate. But my parents did. And what they said that night is something I will never forget for the rest of my life. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a third-grade teacher in Columbus, Ohio. I'm not rich. I never have been. But I've always believed that if you work hard and take care of the people you love, things eventually work out. At least, that's what I used to believe. My son Lucas is 7 years old. He's the kind of kid who makes friends everywhere he goes. Loud laugh. Endless questions. The kind of child who thinks every bug he finds is the coolest thing ever. 3 days before everything changed, he was running around our living room pretending to be a superhero. Then suddenly, he collapsed. At first I thought he had tripped. Kids fall all the time. But when he tried to stand up, he couldn't catch his breath. His face had gone pale. I remember kneeling next to him and asking, "Lucas, buddy, what's wrong?" He just whispered, "My chest hurts." That was the moment the fear started. Within an hour, we were in the emergency room. Doctors rushed him through tests, blood work, x-rays, heart monitoring. And then a cardiologist walked into the room with a look I'll never forget. Serious, focused, careful with his words. He explained that Lucas had developed something called acute cardiomyopathy, a rare complication that can sometimes happen after certain viral infections. In simple terms, his heart was failing. I remember sitting there trying to process what he was saying while Lucas slept in the hospital bed beside me. The doctor told me they could stabilize him temporarily with medication. But that wasn't the real solution. The real solution was surgery. Complicated surgery. Urgent surgery. The kind that needed to happen within 24 hours. And that's when the other conversation started. The one no parent ever wants to have. The cost. The hospital estimated the procedure would cost about $180,000. My insurance as a public school teacher would cover most of it, but not all. After the calculations, the remaining amount was just over $70,000. $70,000. I remember staring at that number on the paperwork and feeling like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. Because I didn't have that kind of money. Not even close. But there were people who did. My parents. Richard Carter is 63 years old. He spent decades building a real estate investment company. My mother, Margaret, who's 60, managed the business with him. They live in a huge house outside the city. They own rental properties, commercial buildings, and just last year they bought a vacation home in Florida. $70,000 wouldn't change their lives. For Lucas, it would mean everything. Calling them was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Our relationship has never been simple. Growing up, my parents believed in one thing above everything else: success, winning, status, appearances. They expected their kids to follow the same path. My older brother Michael, who's 35, went into finance like they wanted. But I chose something different. Teaching. And when I became a single mom at 25, their disappointment became impossible to ignore. Still, Lucas was their grandson. And this was life or death. So I called them. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. When my father answered, I explained everything as calmly as I could. The diagnosis, the surgery, the urgency. He listened quietly. Then he asked one question. "How much is it?" I told him. $70,000. There was a long pause on the phone. Then my mother's voice came through the speaker. "Emily, that's an enormous amount of money." I remember gripping the hospital hallway wall just to stay steady. "This is Lucas," I said. Another pause. Then my father spoke again. "We'll come to the hospital and talk about it." Talk about it. Those 3 words should have worried me more than they did. Because an hour later, when my parents walked into that hospital waiting room, They weren't there to help. They were there to say no. And at that moment, sitting beside my son's ICU bed holding his small hand, I realized something terrifying. My parents were about to make a decision that could determine whether my child lived or died. But what happened 3 minutes after they refused was something none of us were prepared for. Because that was the moment the doctor walked into the room. And the sentence he said next would make my parents go completely silent. There's a moment in life when the truth about someone finally becomes impossible to ignore. Not because they say something shocking, but because they say something calmly, like it's completely reasonable. For me, that moment happened in a quiet hospital waiting room while my 7-year-old son lay in the ICU just down the hallway. And the people sitting across from me were my own parents. Have you ever had a conversation where every second feels heavier than the last? That's exactly what it felt like. The waiting room was almost empty. Just a few plastic chairs, a coffee machine humming in the corner, and a television mounted on the wall playing the news at low volume. I barely noticed any of it. All I could think about was Lucas. The doctors had stabilized him for the moment, but the machines were doing most of the work for his heart. Every hour that passed made the surgery more urgent. When my parents walked in, they looked exactly the same as always. Perfectly put together. My father, Richard Carter, wore a dark wool coat and polished shoes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My mother, Margaret, had her hair styled perfectly, like she had just come from a business meeting instead of an emergency hospital visit. What struck me immediately was the first thing they didn't ask. They didn't ask how Lucas was doing. They didn't ask if I was okay. Instead, my father pulled out a chair, sat down, and said, "Have you spoken with the hospital billing department yet?" I remember staring at him for a moment, unsure if I had heard correctly. "The doctor said he needs surgery tonight," I replied quietly. My mother folded her hands on the table. "Yes, you mentioned that on the phone," she said. "But we need to understand the financial situation clearly." The financial situation. Those words felt so out of place in a hospital full of sick children that I almost laughed. Instead, I pulled out the folder the hospital had given me. Inside were estimates, insurance breakdowns, and payment plans. "The surgery costs around $180,000, I explained. "Insurance covers most of it. But there's still about $70,000 left." My father leaned forward slightly. "$70,000, he repeated. Not shocked. Not concerned. Just calculating. The silence that followed felt endless. I kept waiting for one of them to say something like, "Don't worry, we'll take care of it." But those words never came. Instead, my mother sighed. "Emily," she began carefully, "you have to understand that $70,000 is not a small decision." For a second I thought she was joking. But her expression didn't change. "This is Lucas," I said. My voice cracked slightly despite my effort to stay calm. "Yes," she replied, "but this situation is extremely complicated." Complicated. That word echoed in my head. My son's heart was failing, and somehow the situation had become complicated. My father finally spoke again. "You need to look at this rationally," he said. "Medical procedures like this carry risks. There are no guarantees." I stared at him. "The doctor said the survival rate is 85%. He shrugged slightly. "That still means 15%. It took a moment for the meaning of that statement to sink in. He was talking about Lucas like he was a bad investment. I felt something inside me snap. "You spend more than $70,000 on vacations," I said. "You just bought a beach house last year." My mother's expression hardened slightly. "That's not the same thing." "How is it not the same thing?" I demanded. My father leaned back in his chair. "Because those were our choices." The room suddenly felt colder. I realized exactly what he meant. Lucas wasn't their choice. I swallowed hard. "He's your grandson." Another long silence filled the room. My mother looked down at the paperwork again before speaking. "Emily," she said slowly, "we already helped you a great deal when Lucas was born." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Helped me. As if Lucas himself was some kind of burden they had generously tolerated. "You mean when you paid 2 months of my rent?" I asked quietly. My father's voice grew firmer. "You chose this life. You chose to raise him alone. We cannot be responsible for every crisis that follows. There it was. The truth they had probably believed for years. Lucas wasn't family in their eyes. He was a consequence. A mistake. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. They weren't debating the cost. They had already decided. My mother leaned forward slightly. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. What decision? I asked. Her answer came softly. If the surgery is this expensive, perhaps it isn't meant to happen. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Did she really just say that? My son was lying unconscious in the ICU, and my mother was talking about destiny. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I can't believe you, I whispered. Neither of them moved. Neither of them apologized. I walked out of the waiting room before the tears could come. The ICU hallway felt colder than before. When I stepped into Lucas's room, the machines were still beeping steadily. His small hand lay on the blanket, pale and fragile. I sat down beside him and held it gently. A few seconds later, his fingers squeezed mine weakly. That tiny movement broke me completely. I'm here, I whispered. But in that moment, I had no idea how I was going to save him. And then the door to the room opened. Dr. Daniel Harris stepped inside holding a medical chart. He looked from me to the hallway behind me where my parents were standing. His expression changed slightly. I couldn't help overhearing your conversation, he said quietly. The room went still. Because the next thing the doctor said would change the entire situation. And none of us were ready for it. I used to think the worst moment of that night had already happened. My parents had refused to help. My son was still lying in the ICU. And the clock was moving forward whether I was ready or not. But the truth is, the most important part of that night hadn't even started yet. Because the moment Dr. Daniel Harris stepped into that room, something shifted. And at first, I didn't even realize how big that shift would be. He stood just inside the doorway for a second, holding Lucas's medical chart. Tall, calm, mid-40s maybe. The kind of doctor who looked like he had seen just about everything a hospital could throw at him. But the look on his face told me he had definitely heard enough of the conversation outside. His eyes moved between me and my parents. Then he asked a simple question. Are you Lucas's grandparents? My parents glanced at each other. My father answered. Yes. Dr. Harris nodded slowly. Good, he said. Then it's important that you understand exactly what's happening. He walked a few steps closer to the bed and gently checked one of the monitors beside Lucas. The machine gave its steady, rhythmic beeping. That sound had become the most important sound in my world. Dr. Harris looked back at us. Lucas is currently stable, he explained. But his heart is under extreme strain. The medications are helping temporarily, but they cannot solve the underlying problem. My mother crossed her arms slightly. And the surgery will? Dr. Harris didn't hesitate. Yes. His voice was calm but firm. The procedure we're recommending repairs the damaged portion of the heart muscle and restores normal blood flow. Without it, the condition will continue to worsen. My father leaned against the wall. What are the actual odds? He asked. Dr. Harris answered immediately. With the surgery, Lucas has approximately an 85% chance of full recovery. Then he added something important. Without it, his chances drop dramatically. The room fell quiet again. You'd think hearing numbers like that would make the decision easy, wouldn't it? If someone told you a child had an 85% chance to live, would money even enter the conversation? Apparently for my parents, it still did. My father asked another question. How many times have you performed this procedure? Dr. Harris didn't seem offended. 62 times, he replied. And the outcomes? My father pressed. 53 successful recoveries, the doctor answered. My mother raised an eyebrow slightly. So 9 weren't. Dr. Harris nodded. That's correct. The honesty in his answer actually gave me more confidence. But my parents looked at each other again in that quiet, calculating way I remembered from childhood business dinners. They were still evaluating the situation like it was a negotiation. Then my mother said something that made the room feel instantly colder. Doctor, we're not questioning your expertise, she said politely. But he waited. But we're discussing financial responsibility, she finished. The words hung in the air. For a second, Dr. Harris didn't say anything. He just looked at her. Then he slowly closed the medical chart in his hands. Understood, he said. He turned to me. Emily, may I ask you something? Of course, I said quickly. Are you Lucas's legal guardian? Yes. Do you have sole medical decision authority? Yes. He nodded again. Then he said something I hadn't expected. There may be another option. Hope flickered inside me. What do you mean? I asked. Dr. Harris explained that the hospital had something called a Pediatric Emergency Support Fund. Basically, a charity pool created by donors to help families who couldn't afford life-saving treatments. My heart jumped. So Lucas could qualify? I asked. The doctor hesitated slightly. That's where things become complicated. My stomach dropped. Why? He spoke carefully. The approval process prioritizes families who have no external financial resources. My eyes slowly moved toward my parents. And suddenly I understood. Their wealth wasn't helping Lucas. It was hurting him. Because technically, his family could afford the surgery. They were simply choosing not to. The doctor continued. If the review board determines that the immediate family has access to financial support, approval becomes much more difficult. For the first time that evening, my father looked slightly uncomfortable. My mother remained perfectly composed. We are not responsible for Emily's financial decisions, she said. Dr. Harris studied her face for a moment. Before he could respond, another voice spoke up. Mom. Dad. It was my brother Michael. He had arrived quietly earlier and had been standing near the door most of the time without saying much. Michael Carter was 35, 2 years older than me, and the only person in our family who sometimes challenged our parents. He stepped forward now. This isn't about Emily, he said quietly. This is Lucas. My father shook his head slowly. We've already made our position clear. Michael looked frustrated. He's your grandson. And Emily made choices, my father replied. The tension in the room was thick now. I felt like I was watching my entire family crack open right in front of me. Then Dr. Harris did something unexpected. He stepped closer to my parents. Not aggressively, just calmly. Before you leave, he said, there's something important you should know. My father frowned slightly. What is it? The doctor opened the chart again and glanced down at the lab reports. Then he looked directly at my parents. His tone had changed. Quieter. Sharper. More deliberate. What I'm about to say might change how you look at this situation. The room went completely still. Because the next thing he revealed was something none of us had seen coming. And it would make my parents question everything they thought they knew about Lucas's condition. I thought the doctor was about to argue with them. That's honestly what I expected. Maybe he'd try to convince them. Maybe he'd show them more statistics or talk about the ethics of helping a child. Something emotional. Something persuasive. But that's not what happened. Instead, Dr. Daniel Harris asked a question so simple, it caught everyone in the room completely off guard. How long has Lucas been your grandson? For a second, nobody answered. My mother looked confused. What kind of question is that? She asked. Dr. Harris didn't react to her tone. He just repeated it calmly. How long? My father sighed slightly. 7 years, he said. The doctor nodded. 7 years, he repeated. Then he flipped open Lucas's chart again and scanned a page filled with medical test results. I could hear the faint rustle of paper. The ICU monitor beside Lucas kept beeping steadily. Beep, beep, beep. Dr. Harris looked up again. During Lucas's evaluation, he said, we ran a full genetic panel as part of the cardiomyopathy diagnosis. My parents exchanged a glance. My father frowned slightly. What does that have to do with anything? The doctor closed the chart halfway. Quite a lot, actually. His tone wasn't aggressive. It wasn't emotional either. Just matter of fact. But something about it made the room feel tense. He continued. Lucas's condition isn't random. In many cases, cardiomyopathy develops because of inherited genetic mutations. My mother tilted her head. So you're saying this runs in families? Yes, the doctor replied. There was a short pause. Then he looked directly at my father. Specifically, Lucas carries a genetic marker associated with a hereditary cardiac condition. My father's eyebrows pulled together. And? The doctor spoke slowly now. That mutation usually comes from one side of the family. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. Something about the way he said that made it sound important. Which side? My mother asked. The doctor didn't look away from my father. Based on the genetic patterns and Lucas's blood work, it is extremely likely that the mutation came from the Carter side. The room froze. Completely. For a moment I thought maybe I had misunderstood what he meant. But judging by the way my father's expression changed, I hadn't. That's impossible, my father said immediately. Dr. Harris didn't argue. It's not uncommon, he explained calmly. Many hereditary heart conditions remain undetected for generations until a severe case appears. My mother shook her head slightly. No one in our family has heart problems. The doctor nodded again. Not that you know of. That sentence landed hard. Because it introduced a new idea none of us had considered. Maybe the condition had always been there. Just hidden. Dr. Harris continued explaining. In some families, the mutation remains dormant or causes only minor symptoms like fatigue or mild arrhythmias. But occasionally it manifests aggressively in a younger patient. His eyes shifted briefly toward Lucas in the hospital bed. Like this. The room stayed silent. My brother Michael slowly ran a hand through his hair. Wait, he said. If that's true, does that mean other people in our family could have it? Dr. Harris nodded. Yes. My father crossed his arms defensively. You're making assumptions. I'm making medical observations, the doctor replied calmly. Then he opened the chart again and pointed to a page. These genetic markers are highly specific. My father didn't respond this time. And for the first time that night, he looked unsettled. The entire conversation had shifted. Just minutes earlier, my parents were treating Lucas's illness like some distant financial inconvenience. Now suddenly the illness wasn't distant anymore. It was part of their family, their bloodline, their responsibility. My mother's voice sounded quieter now. If this mutation is genetic, what does that mean for the rest of us? Dr. Harris answered honestly. It means I would strongly recommend that immediate family members consider genetic screening. Michael blinked. You mean, me too? Yes, the doctor said. The realization seemed to ripple through the room. Lucas wasn't just a sick child anymore. He was a warning sign. A signal that something inside the Carter family might have been silently passed down for decades. My father looked away toward the ICU window, where Lucas lay connected to machines. For several seconds, he didn't say anything. Then he muttered quietly, almost to himself. This is ridiculous. But his voice didn't sound confident anymore. Dr. Harris gently closed the chart. I'm not assigning blame, he said. Genetics isn't anyone's fault. He paused. But it does change how we understand the situation. The room felt heavier than ever. Because suddenly, the narrative had flipped. Lucas hadn't simply gotten sick. He had inherited something. And that something had likely come from the very people who were refusing to help him. I stood there watching my parents, trying to read their faces. For the first time that night, my mother looked shaken. My father looked like he was doing calculations in his head again, but this time they weren't about money. They were about legacy, about family, about responsibility. Dr. Harris started to turn toward the door. But then he stopped. He looked back at my parents one last time. And there's one more thing you should know about this surgery. Everyone looked up. The doctor's voice was calm, measured. But the sentence he was about to say would change the entire direction of that night. And when my parents heard it, they went completely silent. The room was so quiet you could hear the air moving through the hospital vents. No one spoke. My father stood with his arms crossed. My mother stared at the floor. My brother Michael leaned against the wall near the door. And Lucas. Lucas was still lying in the ICU bed, surrounded by machines that were doing their best to keep his tiny heart going. Dr. Daniel Harris stood near the doorway, looking at all of us. Then he said the sentence that would change everything. If Lucas doesn't receive the surgery today, he will not survive the week. No dramatic tone. No raised voice. Just a calm statement of fact. For a second, no one reacted. The words just hung there in the air. But the doctor wasn't finished. He took one step closer to my parents and continued. However, he said, if financial approval isn't resolved quickly, I will authorize the surgery anyway. Everyone looked up at him. My father frowned. What do you mean authorize it anyway? He asked. Dr. Harris answered without hesitation. In life-threatening pediatric cases, physicians can activate an emergency ethics override. That allows the hospital to proceed with treatment even if payment has not been secured. The room went completely still again. My mother blinked. You can just do that? Yes, the doctor replied. His voice remained calm, but there was something firm behind it now. We rarely use it. But when a child's life is at risk, it exists for exactly this reason. For the first time that night, my parents didn't have an immediate response. Because suddenly, money wasn't the deciding factor anymore. The surgery could happen with or without them. My father looked irritated. And who exactly pays for it then? The hospital absorbs the cost, Dr. Harris said. There was a long pause. And something interesting happened. My parents didn't look relieved. They looked worried. Really worried. My brother Michael seemed to notice it too. He slowly pushed himself off the wall and stepped forward. You realize something, right? He said quietly. Everyone turned toward him. If the hospital has to override payment for a child whose grandparents are wealthy. He didn't finish the sentence right away. But the implication was obvious. Hospitals keep records. Ethics boards review these decisions. Stories like that don't stay hidden forever. Especially when the people involved are well-known business owners in the community. My father's jaw tightened slightly. Michael continued. That kind of thing gets attention. The room fell silent again. For years, my parents had built their reputation around success, responsibility, and public image. They donated to charities. They attended fundraising events. They were known in the local business community. And now suddenly, they were faced with a different kind of spotlight. The kind that asks uncomfortable questions. Questions like, why did a wealthy family refuse to help their own grandson? My mother looked at my father. For the first time that night, her confidence seemed shaken. Richard, she said quietly. My father rubbed his temple. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked trapped. Because the situation had changed. Before, refusing the surgery was just a private family decision. Now it was something that might become public. Dr. Harris didn't say another word. He simply stood there, waiting. The silence stretched on for several seconds. Then something unexpected happened. My father turned toward the ICU window. Through the glass, Lucas looked impossibly small in that hospital bed. His chest rose and fell slowly under the blanket. Machines blinked beside him. Beep, beep, beep. My father stared at him for a long time. Then he exhaled slowly. My mother finally spoke again. But her voice sounded very different now. Quieter. Less certain. Richard, she said softly. My father didn't respond right away. But after another moment, he nodded once. It was a small movement. Almost invisible. Then my mother turned toward me. Her expression had softened just enough that I could see something I hadn't seen all night. Fear. Emily, she said. I looked at her but didn't say anything. She glanced at my father again before finishing the sentence. Your father will handle the payment. For a moment I wasn't sure I had heard her correctly. My father pulled his phone out of his pocket. I'll contact the billing office, he said quietly. That was it. No apology. No emotional speech. Just a decision. But it was enough. Because 2 hours later, Lucas was being wheeled into the operating room. I remember walking beside the hospital bed as the nurses pushed it down the hallway. Lucas was still sedated, but his hand moved slightly in mine. I'm here, buddy, I whispered. Then the doors to the surgical wing closed behind him. And the waiting began. If you've ever waited during surgery, you know how strange time feels. Minutes stretch into hours. Every sound in the hallway makes you look up. Every time a doctor walks past, your heart jumps. The surgery lasted almost 6 hours. 6 of the longest hours of my life. Finally, just after midnight, the doors opened. Dr. Harris walked toward us, still wearing his surgical cap. I stood up so quickly my chair fell over. He pulled the mask down from his face. And then he smiled. The surgery was successful. I think I stopped breathing for a second. He's stable, the doctor continued. His heart responded exactly the way we hoped. Relief crashed over me so hard my knees almost gave out. Lucas spent another week in the hospital recovering. Then slowly, day by day, he got stronger. Today Lucas is 9 years old. He runs around the yard. He plays soccer. He laughs louder than any kid I know. Most people who meet him would never guess what happened that night. But I still think about it sometimes. Because one thing never changed. My relationship with my parents was never the same after that. Some things, once revealed, can't go back to the way they were. But every time I hear Lucas laughing in the next room, I remember that night. And the sentence that changed everything. Sometimes saving a life comes down to one decision. And sometimes it comes down to one person who refuses to look away.